The High Priestess, written and narrated by Katie Cross. To my little warrior princess, may you always know that your power comes from within. You are power, you are strength, you are ability, and you will change the world. A historical note. If you've read any of my other books in the world of Alkarra, you may have noticed that I never gave specific dates or timelines, especially concerning the year. That's partially because I didn't want people to equate a year in Alkarra to a year in our world. The two are quite different on many levels, and partially because I had no clue just how many books I'd come up with for Alkarra. Now that I've settled in, I think I'll stay a while. But as I've proceeded into the historical collection as a series based on historical events mentioned in my other books, I can see how a firmer timeline is desperately needed. If you're a new listener, listen on. Vittoria awaits. If you've previously listened to the Network series or the Dragon Master trilogy, then let me help you place this in history a bit. The High Priestess takes place starting in the year 1065, during the Castaneda dynasty. You may recognize the name Castaneda because they were toppled by the Aldanas a few hundred years before you meet Diego and Nico Aldana in the third book in the Network series, The High Priest's Daughter. So, this story takes place around 500 years before the Dragon Master trilogy and 600 years before the Network series. I hope that helps. Katie Cross. Chapter 1. An elegant silk dress, the color of blood, spilled across Vittoria's palms. Her hands trembled as she stared at the bottom hem. The thick edge of cream-colored lace was torn at the front of the dress. When she looked more closely, she found that the tear ran all the way through the expensive silk, almost to the knee. She let out a long, slow breath, and the little hairs of silk rippled. The torn fabric sent a glacial chill down her spine. "By the givers," she whispered, "they'll take all my food." Her empty stomach grumbled a worried assent. She picked up the small scrub brush used specifically for lace and dropped it into a bowl of tepid water. Then she frantically surveyed the rest of the elaborate garment. No small feat, with 9 layers of fabric beneath the silk. No other tears, but no way to repair it. Late summer air drifted into the room from an open window, cooling her hot skin. Water boiled in a cauldron over a crackling fire, which sent more humidity into an already damp room. Outside, witches passed by in a quiet background murmur that softened the utter silence of the basement lavanda. Occasional calls rang out from the dressmaker above her. This dressmaker was well known amongst the elite landowners in her city, Necce. To lose this job would cripple Vittoria's chance of buying breathing medicine for Pear, or a meal for her 5-year-old nephew, Anico. A loud thud overhead drew her back to the present. Vittoria straightened her shoulders and mentally pulled herself together. She was a lavanda maid, not a seamstress. She cleaned laundry, didn't fix it. Still, she had to figure something out. Maybe the Andrea wouldn't notice the tear when she came down to check? No chance of that. Of course the Andrea would notice it. If the dress was already promised to a landowner's daughter for an upcoming ball, the girl would demand retribution for the offense. Silk this elegant came only from the Southern Network. It cost more currency than Vittoria would see in her lifetime. An itchy suspicion nagged at her. This Andrea had been sneaky in the past. She may have planted that tear so she could blame Vittoria and not pay her for cleaning both complicated dresses. The mauve dress had 15 different layers that required attention. The Andrea had an older seamstress she'd make fix it with magic, most likely. Vittoria dismissed the suspicion. She wouldn't accuse the woman before she knew for certain. Best to get the work done and deal with it later, though she silently cursed herself for not checking each dress for damage before the Andrea went back to work. At 21 years old, she should have known better. Vittoria shoved a lock of black hair out of her face. She could leave and get no pay, nor ever be able to work here again. Or she could clean the dress and hope for half a food bucket. For the next hour, she focused on her work. The correct potion on the silk, wet heat from a boiling cauldron, scrub, scrub, scrub. What felt like an eternity later, Vittoria slipped the shoulders of the crimson dress onto a wooden hanger as the upper door creaked. Sweat trickled down her back. All the windows were already open, but the stone basement kept heat like an oven. She hung the hanger on a hook in the stone wall and straightened the mauve dress with a few tugs. The footfalls of a heavy-set woman sounded on the stairs just as Vittoria spun around. Seconds later, a squat woman with perpetually slitted eyes appeared. She wore a gray dress that matched her hair, both flat and neat as a pin, and a pair of cloth shoes. A bolt of panic slipped through Vittoria like lightning. Shoes! She'd taken her wooden shoes off an hour ago. The heavy, awkward things made lavanda work impossible. If the Andrea saw her barefoot... Vittoria edged to the left, where a bucket might hide her bare toes. Then she bowed her head. "Andrea?" she murmured. The woman ignored her and approached the dresses with an outstretched hand. First, she touched the mauve silk, running her fingers down the sleeve and inspecting the lace around the neck. Vittoria had cleaned away all the specks of dirt and stray strings. Even the hem was clear, the lace cleaned by hand with her small brush, and a special potion made just for light-colored material. Vittoria clamped her hands behind her back. The caustic soap had reddened the skin over her knuckles, but the dress practically glowed. The Andrea turned away from that one after studying each of the 15 underlayers, each perfect, as always. Humph! Vittoria held her breath as the Andrea moved on. The front of the crimson dress faced the stone wall. Perhaps she wouldn't... What? The Andrea muttered coldly. Is this? She'd noticed the issue unusually fast, as if she'd been looking for it. The woman flipped the dress around and motioned to the tear. Vittoria drew in a breath. It was there when I began, Andrea, before I even took it off the hook. It wasn't. When I went to clean the lace on the hem, I noticed it. The Andrea's beady eyes tapered until they became mere lines. You expect me to believe that? Why would I tear it? How would I tear it? There's nothing sharp down here. Laziness, the Andrea cried. Foolishness. You stepped on it. You're nothing but a lavanda maid, so what do you know? Vittoria hid a flinch. Andrea, I assure you I didn't cause that tear. My work is sound, and it always has been. I've worked here many times in the past. Your dresses are otherwise perfectly laundered and prepared for presentation to your buyers. No food for you today. The Andrea waved a hand. Go. Don't come back. You're not welcome here anymore. But I did the work you conscripted me to do today. Please, just cut the amount of food if you're upset. I should at least get payment for the mauve. Go, the woman shouted, a strand of hair falling from her thick bun. Vittoria longed to shout back. Her throat ached with it. She'd spent 6 hours on the mauve dress. 6 hours she'd never get back. 6 hours of stolen time. And what could she do about it? Vittoria clenched her fists. Inigo's tiny, smudged face floated through her mind. He would go hungry again tonight. Per would cough and moan in his sleep. All of this was for nothing. Vittoria hesitated a moment, then opened her mouth to counter again. Warmth wrapped around her throat, silencing her like a strangling hand. Magic. The Andrea had used a silencing spell on her. Rage simmered deep under the surface of Vittoria's mind. Not a word, the woman said through gritted teeth, or I'll have your tongue cut out. Go. The Andrea gathered both dresses and turned to go up the stairs, but not before casting a suspicious look over her shoulders, as if Vittoria would chase after her. Vittoria wanted to throw the brush, but refrained out of fear. The landowners lived out on a peninsula near the ocean, amongst elaborate homes, shops, and gardens made of bleached stone, but they had shops in Necce. Both in Necce and on the peninsula, guardians roamed the cobblestone streets. One move against the Andrea, and she'd be sent to prison to waste away and die. If she were conscripted to a house, which she never had been, they'd sew her mouth shut for talking back, a favorite punishment among the noble elite. Then Per would die. Inigo would starve. No, Mare and Per had already lost one child. She couldn't abandon them out of frustration at a worthless Andrea who stole her time and used magic against her. Other workers had endured far worse. Vittoria closed her eyes, stuffed her rage into a little corner in the back of her mind, and turned to find her wooden shoes. Tears made her vision hot and blurry, but she blinked them back. No, she wouldn't waste any tears on such a wretched witch. With any luck, La Salvatorra, the giver of justice, would come and shred those dresses to ribbons in the night. She sighed. If only the givers were real. When she crouched to pick up her clogs, she stopped. Sitting next to her shoes, near the back door, was a wooden bucket with a metal handle. The interior of the bucket was heaped with flat pita bread, linen bags the size of her palm, shiny apples, and what appeared to be slices of smoked eel. A bright blue symbol the size of her palm hovered over it, conjured by magic. It was an intricate woven design, like hundreds of braids tied together. The sign of La Salvatorra. Her breath caught as the sign faded. Hadn't she just thought of La Salvatorra? Had she somehow summoned him here? No, that was insane. The tears she'd valiantly fought disappeared as she touched the food. The bread was pillowy and warm. The seeds in the small linen bags were crisp. Even the apples smelled fresh, as if they'd come straight from the orchards that ringed the northern outskirts of Necce. She looked around, but, of course, the lavanda was empty. There was nothing here but potion bottles on the wall, and barrels of fresh water, as usual. Of course he wasn't here. La Salvatorra was a reputed giver, and famously powerful with magic. But she imagined he was little more than a bored landowner who liked to help others. How did he know? She glanced at the window. He'd overheard, perhaps. Did La Salvatorra prowl around the city to find workers to help? Or had he happened on her? Vittoria shook herself. It didn't matter. For a moment, she could almost believe La Salvatorra was real. That givers, magical witches sent by the goddess of the sea, actually watched over workers, listened to their prayers, brought justice, hope, courage, or strength. But the givers were myths, tales, legends that workers told each other in the dark, miserable, hungry nights while the landowners took their food. La Salvatorra, or rather, the witch who had been offering gifts to workers under the symbol of La Salvatorra, spurring on rumors of a giver in the streets, was likely a charitable landowner, a rogue, for no one knew him. He hid behind his magic but served the workers. Yet the workers believed him to be endowed with power from prana, here to dispense justice on their behalf. And somehow he'd heard of her plight right now. Aniko would not go hungry today. A feeling of sheepishness crawled over Vittoria. La Salvatorra was the giver of the Mayfair coven, to which she belonged. Surely, Mare would count this as proof of the giver's existence. "He has watched over us," she would say. "The giver see all." Skeptical, but still grateful, Vittoria gathered the 5 pitas, 5 apples, and several smoked eels, one for each of them at the house. She stuffed them into the deep pockets Mare had sewn into her dress. They weighed her down, but the folds of her skirt managed to hide them. Only a fool carried their food for others to steal. More food remained in the bucket, of course. Vittoria gathered the rest in her hands, then stepped out of the basement lavanda with relief. A warm wind brushed over her skin as she stood in the crowded Necce alley. The back entrance kept her separated from the landowners on the cobblestone roads. Only workers flowed through the alleys back here. The castle divided Necce into 2 sections. The landowners' homes occupied all of the peninsula on the southern edge of the city. The castle, and all its resplendent magnolia trees and gardens, stood like a gleaming sentinel to the north of the peninsula. Beyond the castle lay North Necce, where landowners shopped and managed their trades, and where the workers lived. Not 3 steps into the alley, a figure huddled in the shadows. Vittoria stopped, crouched down, and peered into the face of a female witch. A gaping red eye socket stared back at her. Dried blood drained down a gaunt cheek. The other eye was a warm chocolate brown, bloodshot from tears. This injury was recent and clearly still painful. "Allô," Vittoria whispered. She passed a piece of pita bread over. "For you, Mateo." The wrinkled, trembling hand reached out from folds of filthy clothes. A witch's lips formed the words, "Thank you," as she pulled the bread to wrinkled lips. A mouthful of teeth meant she must be young, though it was hard to tell. Was she caught looking at something a landowner believed she shouldn't? Falsely accused of something else? Did it matter? Vittoria squeezed her hand and shuffled to the next hungry soul on the street. "Here, Mateo," she murmured to a one-armed beggar. "You call me your friend?" he asked in a shaky voice as he snatched the food. He growled, but it was confusion, not anger. Vittoria smiled. "All workers should be friends, shouldn't we? Have some food. May la principessa bless you." A charcoal drawing decorated the alley wall nearby, a picture of a woman with long hair, her hands held out at her sides. Despite streaked dirt and what appeared to be dried blood on her feet, a shockingly white magnolia flower rested on the woman's chest, unmarred by filth and time. Vittoria slowed, let out a deep breath, and touched the foot of the drawing. She murmured the salutation to La Principessa, giver of hope, before she gave away the last of the food. La Salvatorra had blessed her today. She might not believe in the givers, but at least she knew that. The ocean chanted softly near the pier as Vittoria slipped through the streets of the Mayfair Coven early the next morning. Shouts from Navy ships, the scurrying of rats, and the quiet illumination of candles in the windows enveloped her as she left her coven and headed towards South Necce to find a landowner home in need of a lavanda maid. She'd gotten a late start after a coughing fit sent Pear into spasms. Mare left her for a conscripted job as a cook in the Moretti household, well before the sun came up, which left Vittoria to care for Pear. Settling him had taken longer than she'd expected. A late lavanda maid was a hungry one. Minutes later, she winced as a third wooden door slammed in her face. "No work," the Andrea of a restaurant called through the door. "Gone back next week." "Well," Vittoria scowled, "I didn't want to work for you either." With a sigh, she started down the alley again. Dawn lightened the far horizon as she headed for an inn she'd worked in before. It was the second day of a 6-day week, which meant there would still be leftover laundry from the weekend. Landowners always traveled from the country to the city on the weekends. The advantage of having 2 houses. Her stomach growled even though it was satisfied by the food La Salvatorra had given her the night before. As she passed a lone statue of La Cristiana, giver of courage, her fingertips trailed along the bottom of the statue. La Cristiana always had bare feet. She was worshipped in the East End Coven, but all workers appreciated her statue. Every worker needed courage. Her mind wandered back to La Salvatorra as she walked. She'd heard of the mysterious giver who showed himself in person, but she'd ignored the tales until now. How did he find witches who needed him? That wouldn't be hard in Necce. Did he use magic to be invisible? She shuddered at the thought. The use of magic, she'd long ago decided, was quite rude. While her mind wandered, she approached another inn. Before she could knock, she caught sight of another lavanda maid through the window. The maid waved to Vittoria with an apologetic grin. Vittoria smiled, waved back, and continued on. "Givers," she muttered. Another 5 locations yielded no work. Desperate, she abandoned the landowners to check the less wealthy places in North Necce. She found herself in the narrow, dank alleys of the Necce Coven. With a shiver, she continued north, toward friendlier places. The Necce Coven was thick with rebels who attacked the landowners in riots and ignored the High Priest's edicts. They were always trying to recruit more workers into their dangerous ranks. They also had their heads cut off by guardians and placed on pikes in the alleys. The giver of peace, La Turere, peered down at Vittoria as she scurried past, his face stern with hidden rebuke. Odd that a man who gave peace would appear so annoyed all the time. Vittoria sighed. Another hour of searching, and she'd be firmly out of a job for the day. Perhaps her luck had run out with La Salvatorra aiding her yesterday. With hope, Vittoria knocked on the basement door of a brothel. Another lavanda maid opened it, then shook her head. She had the same black hair and dark eyes as Vittoria, as all the witches in the Eastern network. "I'm sorry, Vittoria," she said quietly. "Not today." Vittoria smiled. "Thank you. Have a good day." The girl closed the door, her wooden shoes loud on the stone floor as she walked away. Vittoria let out a long breath. Home, then. She'd head back to Mayfair Coven, care for Pear, take care of Anico. Her neighbor, Alona, had injured herself yesterday. Vittoria could visit her. She spun around with a sigh, then came to an abrupt stop. A food bucket hovered in the air right in front of her. La Salvatorra's mark glowed above it. Startled, she simply stared at it for a moment. Another food bucket? The sign began to dissipate into clouds. Vittoria reached out. As soon as she touched the bucket, the magic holding it in the air vanished, and it sank into her hands. This couldn't be a mere stroke of luck this time. No. Had he followed her? Been following her? "Allô?" she called. The alley yielded nothing but wet stone walls, wisps of receding fog, and the refuse dumped out of the windows. She stepped further into the shadows. "La Salvatorra?" No witches peered down on her from windows. She craned her head back, none on the rooftops that she could see. His ability to do magic gave him all the advantage, because he could be standing next to her for all she knew. The High Priest, Hode, had passed an edict over 20 years ago that prevented workers from receiving any education. No reading, no writing, no magic. Vittoria stared at the food in breathless surprise. A tumult of emotions filled her. Relief, elation, disbelief. Was she lucky? Did she have a hidden savior? Realizing that she was standing in the middle of an alley with a full bucket of food, she quickly stuffed some into her pockets. Pita bread again. Cheese this time. Yellow and thick with a hard red rind. What luxury! She broke off a piece and carefully placed it in her pocket. 5 pitas, a hearty chunk of cheese, and 2 bags of seeds later, she still had over half a bucket. That would feed her, Inigo, Mare, and Pear for another day. There would even be enough for Sonara, Inigo's mother, if she happened to come home today. Mare's food rations from her work as a cook in the Moretti house would buy more medicine for Pear that they could store. If she saved it, they could buy extra potions, or have 2 meals today. The call of a beggar in the street pierced her ears. La Turedre, heard my plea. Vittoria sighed. No, she wouldn't have 2 meals today. They'd have 1, like always, and she'd give the rest away. Luck, or La Salvatorra, had happened on her twice. She should share the goodness. Well, she cast her gaze around her again. Though she spoke to the air, she had a feeling that someone was listening. Then I'll share it if you're going to be so generous. There are many injured who go to the Elizer of the giver La Principessa. I shall share this with them there. Thank you. She couldn't be sure, but she thought she heard a soft, masculine chuckle as she left the alley. Tori! A happy shriek greeted Vittoria when she returned to their home a few hours later. A mop of unruly hair crashed into her legs. She staggered backward, laughing. Hello, Anico. Anico tilted his head back and stared at her with wide eyes. Like his pair, her brother Anton, he had dusky skin and a fast smile. His youthful, still bright grin pulled at her heartstrings. Today, wrinkles on his forehead betrayed his concern. You're back? He asked, puzzlement in his voice. I am. But no work means. Vittoria smiled and crouched next to him. Today, I have a special surprise. La Salvatorra has visited me again. His eyes widened. Food? More food. She reached into her pocket and gave him the largest piece of round pita bread. Here. Anico snatched it out of her hands and stuffed a quarter of it into his face in seconds. Vittoria pulled it away. Take your time, she chided gently. You'll become sick. Enjoy your food, Anico. You're impetuous, like your pair. She tapped his nose. Cheeky. He grinned and her heart melted. Mare says that pair smiled just like me, he said around a mouthful of bread. He did. Anico widened his smile, then grabbed a stick that had fallen to the ground. Thank you, Tori. I love having so much food. La Salvatorra should come every day. She ruffled his hair and straightened up. Do me a favor, Mizuna. Go next door and check on Olona. He grimaced. She was hurt, Tori. Her arm has blood on it. I know. I saved some food for her. Tell her I'll be there in a few minutes, then wait for me there. She loves talking to you. You can tell her stories and brighten her day. About La Emanuela. He jumped, wielding his stick like a sword. I'm La Emanuela, and I'm strong. Vittoria laughed as he parried an unseen foe and spun around so quickly he fell on his rump. Go, giver of strength. She nudged him back to the door. I will be there in a moment. Anico disappeared outside with another cry, waving his stick against invisible invaders. Vittoria shut the creaky door behind her, expression placid as she moved to the rickety table in the middle of their square home. She unloaded the food on a flat wooden tray there, grateful to see it so full for a second day in a row. They lived at the bottom of a 3-story building in the Mayfair Coven. Years ago, maybe 100, it used to be a landowner's house. After the Great Divide between classes, decades before Vittoria's birth, the owner had dashed to the peninsula and abandoned this building. Vittoria's family lived in a room on the bottom floor, 5 witches in a square space meant as more of a storage closet. Charcoal drawings of givers populated the walls of the home. Mare redrew them every week, worried that if they forgot one, the giver would be upset. A wet, wheezy cough issued from Pear's chest. He beckoned her with a wave. La Salvatorra again today? He asked. Yes. She handed him a pita, but he waved it back with a warm smile. He placed a hand on her cheek. Later, Mazuna. We eat as a family, always. Vittoria put her hand over his. Shocks of white streaked his thin black hair. She imagined, if he were a landowner, it would be thick and full. A scraggly beard covered his face now, hiding his gaunt cheeks. His eyes used to dance. Per always loved to tell amusing stories on the farm, but now they were glazed with pain. She put a hand on a knobby knee beneath his blanket. "And your legs?" she asked. He shrugged, but one hand rubbed his right thigh, which was little more than bone, lying inert beneath the blanket. All the muscle had wasted away. 6 years ago, Vittoria and her family had lived on the farms far outside Necce. A cow had trampled Per, slamming a hoof onto his back and breaking it. Unable to walk or work, he faced execution by the landowner. Vittoria, Anton, and Mare had carried him away in the night. Eventually, they took refuge in Mayfair Coven to scrounge for work in Necce. That was years ago, when her brother Anton still lived and things weren't quite so frightening. Now, Per lived on a mattress on the floor. Infections plagued his lungs, while the rest of them scrambled to earn food every day. Vittoria had been 15 when they arrived in Necce. Most girls were conscripted and assigned to a trade by age 6. Per's intermittent sicknesses and, eventually, Aniko's birth meant someone had to be home to care for them. Vittoria worked as a lavanda maid so she didn't have to show up to a conscripted service every day, like Mare. On the days when Per and Aniko needed someone at their side, Vittoria was there. "There is more potion for your pain." Vittoria stood to reach for the glass bottle of light yellow potion that sat on a counter far out of Aniko's reach. "It's fresh, Per, from last night. Why don't you have some?" No, it's too soon. We shouldn't use it too much. I'm fine. Sonara left a little while ago." "Sonara was here. We haven't seen her in weeks." "She didn't stay long. Aniko didn't even see her." Vittoria tensed. Sonara, her brother's widow, moved like a fog most days. She was 21, like Vittoria, and had birthed Aniko at the young age of 16. She came home with food or supplies every now and then, but never told them how she found it. Per assumed she sold herself to desperate men, and he said in vulnerable moments how he hated the circumstances that drove her to it. But Sonara had never confirmed any of their questions. Sonara did Sonara's business. "Alona," Per continued with a yawn. "She's fevering now." "I'll go see her." Vittoria pulled a thin blanket from her cloth-hanging bed and tucked it over him. He smiled at her from a mattress filled with old straw on the floor. They'd need to change it soon. When she looked at Per, she thought of her dead brother, Anton, with a pang that never seemed to fade. "These food buckets." Per tilted his head back to stare at the ceiling, hands folded over his stomach. Vittoria grabbed a stick with twigs tied at the bottom and swept their hard-packed dirt floor. "What about the buckets?" she asked. "Do you think La Salvatorra is giving them to you for a reason?" "He's only given me 2, Per." He made a sound in his throat. "But twice means he's followed you. Twice means something." 2 isn't a pattern." "Not yet." She frowned. Did it mean something? Maybe La Salvatorra had stumbled on her twice, though that wasn't very likely. Per had a point, one she didn't like. Had La Salvatorra followed her? Did he want something in return? Per broke into her thoughts. "Then again, who are we to question the givers?" She hid a scowl as she pulled a few wooden sticks off the floor and set them on the table for Aniko to find again later. "La Salvatorra is a witch, Per. A landowner, likely, and as much our enemy as he is a savior. He's called La Salvatorra by the workers, but that doesn't make him a giver." Per chuckled. "Ah, Vittoria, you are so serious-minded for such a young woman." His expression sobered into melancholy. "I'm sorry that your life has required you to face such truth so soon. Of course the givers are stories, but they do work, don't you think? Do we not feel more hope when we pray to La Principessa, more courage when we speak to La Cristiana?" Her response caught in her throat. "Per." He waved her off. "No, I understand. You don't have to believe, Vittoria. The givers will bless you anyway." His eyes drifted closed with another yawn as he readjusted his body farther into the mattress. "Just don't tell your mare." Vittoria watched him fade into sleep as she set the broom back in the corner. Then she grabbed a pita bread, pinched off a chunk of cheese, and headed over to Alona's with La Salvatorra on her mind.